Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. For those of you who haven't heard about Quest for the Janklord, it's a fantastic Commander gameplay channel. Essentially, these four guys struck a deal with a demon, and now they have to play jank EDH forever. And thanks to a series of events, I got pulled into their madness too. So make sure you check out their most recent episode where I battle it out with them. Anyways, let's get into their deck building rules. The commander's going to be randomly selected, so I have no choice on what commander that I'm building around. All cards have to be equal to or less than 79 cents when the deck is built. So some cards were excluded because at that time they were over that price, and other cards were included that are currently over 79 cents. And of course, the winner gets to leave the dungeon and gets to spend a month in the real world. So you know, your standard Magic rules. But anyways, let's get into it. On this deck tech, I'm going to take you through its strategy, the tactics, and how this deck wins. This show and episodes like this one are possible because of viewers like you. So if you're looking for some easy ways to help support the show, make sure you like this episode and share it with friends. And make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Another easy way to support this channel is by using our TCGplayer affiliate links. So make sure that you're looking for those links in the description whenever you're buying a deck or just individual cards. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. The commander that was randomly selected for me was Jori En Ruin Diver. She's a 2/3 merfolk wizard that costs 1 blue-red. And she has, when you cast your second spell each turn, draw a card. So as long as she's on the battlefield and you're casting more than one spell each turn, she can gain you incremental value. Now there's a couple different directions that you can take this commander. My first thought was to make a spell slinging deck. Her trigger isn't limited to just your turn. So if you can cast 2 instants on your opponent's turns as well, you can draw extra cards. After digging into that build though, that 79 cent restriction really comes into play. So my next thought was to focus on artifacts. Artifacts are an archetype that can work really well within a budget. There are a ton of cheap and efficient artifacts to choose from, and Jori En can be a good incremental engine for you. So the inspiration for this build draws heavily from my Jori deck. Jori's effect may be a lot more powerful than Jori En, but Jori En still provides you a good amount of value throughout the game. When you're building within budget restrictions, you make do with what you've got. So an artifact storm build was the most powerful direction that I could find for Jori En. So what's our strategy with this deck? Well, we're going to gain incremental value by casting cheap artifacts. It's going to be very easy for us to cast at least 2 artifacts on our turns. And outside of our commander, we've got other ways to produce value with our artifacts too. And then how do we win with this deck? We're going to ping down our opponents, or we're going to storm off with our artifacts. This deck is able to put out a ton of artifacts throughout the game. And once we're set up properly, we can even cast an incredible amount in 1 turn. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to take you through 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how we're going to win with it. So now let's start off with tactic number 1, Geology. First up, we're running Renegade Map, Traveler's Amulet, and Wanderer's Twig. Each of these we can sacrifice to get a basic land into our hand. With this deck, we're looking for cheap artifacts that can provide us value. In a budget deck, these being able to help us fix our mana early can be huge. And it's also important for us to ramp, so we're going to be running things like Guardian Idol, Fractured Power Stone, and Mind Stone. Guardian Idol enters the battlefield tapped and can tap for a colorless. On top of that, we can pay 2 to temporarily make it a 2/2. And then Fractured Power Stone and Mind Stone both tap for a colorless. On top of that, we can pay 1 and tap and sacrifice Mind Stone to draw a card. Next up, we've got some mana rocks that can help us fix our mana with Prismatic Lens, Sphere of the Suns, and Pillar of Origins. Prismatic Lens can either tap for a colorless, or we can use it to filter our mana. Sphere of the Suns enters battlefield tapped, and we can tap it for 1 mana of any color 3 times. And when Pillar of Origins enters the battlefield, we can choose a creature type. And then we can tap it to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool, but we can only spend that mana on a creature spell of the chosen type. Next up, we've got some slightly less efficient mana rocks with Mana Geode and Unstable Obelisk. Although they might be less efficient, they do provide us some additional utility. When Mana Geode enters the battlefield, we scry 1. And we can pay 7 to tap and sacrifice Unstable Obelisk to destroy target permanent. And then we're running both Sisay's Ring and Urgolem's Eye, both of which do the exact same thing. They cost 4 and tap for 2. And finally, there's Clock of Omens, which isn't technically a mana rock, but it pretty much turns all of our artifacts into one. It has tap 2 untapped artifacts you control, untap target artifact. So as long as we have at least 1 mana rock in play, we can use our other artifacts to untap it. So basically, if you break it down, all of our other artifacts can tap for half a mana. And if we've got a mana rock that taps for 2 like Sisay's Ring, then each of our artifacts can essentially tap for 1. Our opponents might not realize it right away, but this can provide us a ton of value throughout the game. But we're not quite done with ramping just yet. So it's time to move on to tactic number 2, Mana Buddies. First up, there's Walking Atlas, which we can tap to put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield. With the amount of cards that we can draw at this deck, we're bound to end up with a couple of extra lands. Instead of those lands having to sit in our hand, Walking Atlas can make use of them. Next up, we've got some mana dorks, starting off with Hedron Crawler, Mannequin, and Milliken. They each may only tap for a colorless, but we've got other ways to fix our mana with this deck. Some of those ways include Silver Mirror and Iron Mirror, one of which taps for blue and the other taps for red. And then there's Palladium Mirror, which is a fantastic source of ramp. It only costs 3, but it taps for 2. But the mana dork that provides the most ramp is probably Chief Engineer. It says artifact spells you cast have Convoke. So basically all of our creatures can help cast those spells, and each creature we tap while casting an artifact spell pays for 1 or 1 mana of that creature's color. So even our creatures that aren't mana dorks like our commander can now help us cast spells. But we've also got some other creatures that don't tap for mana but actually help ramp us too. Let's go over them now in tactic number 3, less is more. The first one of these cards is actually going to be our golden pig of the deck, which is the number 1 card out of our 99. And the golden pig for this deck is Ethereum Sculptor. It's a 1/2 Vidalcan Artificer that costs 1 and a blue. It has artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. As nice as standard ramp can be, reducing cost in artifact decks can be just much more impactful. Getting a reduced cost or being able to cast artifacts for free is huge. If we can keep drawing into more and more cheap artifacts, we can just keep casting them if it's beneficial for us to do so. And it also might benefit us to bounce artifacts back to our hand so that we can recast them too. One simple card like Ethereum Sculptor can save us a ton of mana throughout the game. It's not the only cost reducer that we have, but it is our best one. The amount of value that it can provide us is unrivaled, and that's why it's the golden pig of this deck. But the more cost reducers that we have in play, the better. So we're also going to be running Herald of Kozilek, and Jori Familiar. Herald of Kozilek says, colorless spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and Jori Familiar says, historic spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. For this deck's purposes, they both do the exact same thing. They make our artifacts cheaper to cast. If we can get multiple of these cost reducers in play, the vast majority of our artifacts are going to be free. And that can lead to some really explosive turns. Another cost reducer that might not seem like it is actually Mirror the Forebearers. When it enters the battlefield, we choose a creature type and we can pay 1, and until the end of the turn, Mirror the Forebearers becomes a copy of target creature you control of the chosen type, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. So this can be one of our cost reducers, or can turn into one of our value engines. It really just depends on the situation. And we've even got a way to help pay for our non-artifact spells with Inspiring Statuary. It says non-artifact spells you cast have improvise. So our artifacts can help cast those spells. Each artifact we tap after we're done activating mana abilities pays for 1. During those explosive turns, this allows us to keep going while we otherwise wouldn't be able to. And again, it helps us utilize artifacts in a different way. But what are some of those non-mana producing artifacts that can help with this? Let's go through some now in tactic number 4, I Want to Be Free. First up, we've got Ornithopter and Phyrexian Walker, both of which cost 0. And although Metalwork Colossus technically costs 11, in this deck it really just costs 0. Because it costs X less to cast for X of the total converted mana cost of non-creature artifacts we control. On top of that, if it happens to die, we can get it right back by sacrificing 2 artifacts to get it back to our hand. And a 10/10 that we can essentially cast for free and get back is definitely a threat to our opponents. As I mentioned before, we're looking for artifacts that are cheap to cast and provide us value. So we're also going to be running Sentinel Totem. It only costs us 1, and when it enters the battlefield, we scry 1. On top of that, we can tap to exile it and exile all cards from all graveyards. So this can help us with card selection and with decimating graveyard decks. Next up, we've got some artifacts that can replace themselves with Phyrexian Furnace and Scrabbling Claws. Being able to replace our artifacts for cheap is a great way to keep us going. So we're also going to be running Aether Spellbomb and Pyrite Spellbomb. Each of these cards have different ways to provide us value. Aether Spellbomb can bounce a creature, and Pyrite Spellbomb can deal 2 damage to any target. But the most important thing is that we can replace these cards when we need to. Next up, we've got Barb Sexton and Terrarian, which can both help us filter our mana on top of drawing us a card. And finally, there's Conjurer's Bauble, which is essentially a 1-mana cantrip. When we tap and sacrifice it, we put up to 1 target card from our graveyard on the bottom of our library and we draw a card. But we've also got some artifacts that we don't have to sacrifice to generate us value. So let's go through them now in tactic number 5, Can You Cantrip. First up, there's Icor Wellspring, which when it enters the battlefield or is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, we draw a card. Artifacts like this are ones that can really make the deck go. If we can keep bouncing this card back to our hand and recasting it, we can get some extra value out of it. So we're also going to be running Alchemist Vial, which when it enters the battlefield, we draw a card. And on top of that, if we want to, we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it, and target creature can attack or block this turn. And finally, we've got Elsmar Flask, Guild Globe, and Prophetic Prism. Each of these not only help us fix our mana, but they also cantrip when they come into play. But we've got some ways to get some extra value out of all of our artifacts too. Let's go through those ways now in tactic number 6, Top of Mind. First up, we've got Artificer's Assistant, which says whenever you cast a historic spell, scry 1. So whenever we cast an artifact, we can remove a dead card from the top of our library. That's going to allow us to filter past lands and to get to more artifacts to cast. A similar card to this is Burning Prophet, which says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Burning Prophet gets +1/+0 until end of turn, then scry 1. So while our artifact creatures won't provide us any value with this, our instants and sorceries will. Next up, there's Riddlesmith, which says whenever you cast an artifact spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So this allows us to loot, which can be even more valuable than scrying. If we have any dead lands in our hand, we can ditch them for some more valuable cards. A similar card to this is Quicksmith Genius. It says when an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So instead of looting, this is actually rummaging, which is not quite as good, but is still very effective. And while Riddlesmith only counts on cast, this counts on any artifact entering the battlefield, and that includes tokens. But outside of these ways of providing us card advantage, we've got other ways too. So let's go through them now in tactic number 7, Refuel. First up, there's Gearpoor Orrery. It allows everyone to play an extra land on their turn. It also says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, that player draws 3 cards. This deck can play a lot of cards at once. Now, normally you have to manage those cards to make sure that you're getting value out of your commander. Remember, it takes casting 2 spells to draw 1 card. So generally, it's not a good idea to completely dump your hand, even if you can. But Gearpoor Orrery actually incentivizes you for that. Because if you have no cards in your hand, you get 3 cards at your next upkeep. It's a high risk, high reward play, but if it stays on the battlefield for a while, it can provide you an incredible amount of value. Just keep in mind that it can also provide your opponent's value too. A good simple draw spell for this deck though is Thoughtcast. It has affinity for artifacts and it says draw 2 cards. So essentially for just 1 mana, you get to draw 2. We're also going to be running Read the Runes, which says, draw X cards for each card drawn this way, discard a card unless you sacrifice a permanent. This can provide us a ton of value, and there are even some permanents that we don't mind sacrificing. At the very least, it can help us replace some dead lands in our hand. And finally, there's Commune with Lava, which is a fantastic card. It says, exile the top X cards of your library until the end of your next turn you may play those cards. Once it's set up correctly, this deck can cast a ton of spells in one turn, and Commune with Lava works perfectly with that. If you want to hear more about why I think this card is underrated, go check out my Quest Recorders episode on it. Regardless, it's one way to set up a huge turn with this deck. But what are some other ways that we can really take advantage of all of our cheap artifacts? Let's go through some other ways now in tactic number 8, Bounce House. First up, we're running Displacement Wave, which says return all non-land permanents with converted mana cost X or less to their owner's hands. This card is extremely flexible, and we can cast it for whatever X value benefits us most. If we want to keep a cost reducer like Herald of Kozilek in play, we just have to cast this for 2. That's going to bounce back most of our artifacts, and then we can recast those for value. Another card that can help us out is Aether Gale. It says return 6 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. This card is fantastic in that it lets us pick and choose what we want to bounce. So we can bounce artifacts that are beneficial to us, but we can also bounce our opponent's permanents too. Next up, there's Rebuild, which says return all artifacts to their owner's hands. While we want to have our artifacts bounce, our opponents probably don't. If they're running Mana Rocks, this can really set them back while helping us out. But our best bounce spell in this deck is probably Paradoxical Outcome. It says return any number of target non-land, non-token permanents you control to their owner's hands. And draw a card for each card returned to your hand this way. So not only can this bounce whatever artifacts we want to bounce, but it can also draw us an incredible amount of cards. But what's our endgame in all this? How are we supposed to win with all these cheap artifacts? Let's go through some ways to win in tactic number 9, Firestorm. First up, we've got Firebrand Archer and Reckless Fireweaver. Firebrand Archer says, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it's going to deal 1 damage to each opponent. And then Reckless Fireweaver is very similar. It says, whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. With all the cheap artifacts that we're casting, bouncing, and recasting, we're going to deal a ton of damage with each of these. And we can have our artifacts deal even more damage with something like Gearpore Aether Grid. It says, tap 2 untapped artifacts you control, Gearpore Aether Grid deals 1 damage to our creature or player. This can help us turn our cheap artifacts into sources of perpetual damage. They can help us control the board by taking down creatures, or they can take out players too. But we can also use our artifacts to actually make creatures as well. Cards like Efficient Construction and Golem Foundry are fantastic at this. Efficient Construction says, whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. And Golem Foundry says, whenever you cast an artifact spell, you may put a charge counter on Golem Foundry. By removing 3 of those charge counters, you can put a 3/3 colorless Golem artifact creature token onto the battlefield. With the amount of artifacts that we can cast in this deck, we can make some huge armies with these. And then with the Antiquities War, we can actually just make an army with the artifacts that are already on the board. The first 2 lore counters are going to make us look at the top 5 cards of our library, and we can reveal an artifact card from among them and put it into our hand. But its third lore counter can be game ending. It says artifacts you control become artifact creatures with base power and toughness 5/5 until end of turn. So every single one of our artifacts becomes a beater that can just destroy our opponents. But perhaps my favorite win condition is to Storm off with Temporal Fissure. It's a very simple spell. It says return target permanent to its owner's hand, and it has Storm. So when we cast it, we copy it for each spell cast before it this turn, and we can choose new targets for the copies. If we can cast and recast enough cheap artifacts, we can Storm off to win. Essentially, at a certain point, we can bounce our opponent's entire boards, including their lands, and then we can win however we want from there. Even without being a win condition, this is a fantastic utility spell too. If our Storm count isn't high enough to win, we can just bounce our own permanents so that we can recast them too. Or we can just pick and choose whatever permanents are giving us trouble. Regardless, this deck is very flexible with how it can win. But we're not quite done just yet, and still have a couple more cards to cover. Let's go over those stragglers in tactic number 10, Island and Misfit Toys. First up, there's Codex Shredder, which is a fantastic card in this deck. By paying 5 and tapping and sacrificing it, we can return target card from our graveyard to our hand. This is a huge effect and should not be undervalued. It can be a way to get back one of our key pieces or one of our win conditions. Next up, there's Voyager Staff, which is a great way to protect one of our key pieces. By paying 2 and sacrificing it, we can exile target creature and return the exile card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. And finally, there's Dramatic Reversal, which can set up some huge turns. It says untap all non-land permanents you control. So this can generate us a ton of mana with our Mana Rocks, or we can use something like Gearpore Aether Grid to deal a ton of damage with it. Again, there are many different directions you can take when building a deck around Jori En. But the most effective one that I found with these budget restrictions was Artifact Storm. Again, if you haven't seen Quest for the Janklord yet, there's no better time than now. I had a lot of fun playing with him, and it was a very intense and fun game. So go see how this deck performed in their episode. But now that we've gone through the spells in this deck, let's go on to the mana base. First up, there's Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap to sacrifice to search our library for basic land and put into play tapped. Then there's Aether Hub, which can tap for a color, or can tap for any color once. Next up, there's Izzet Guildgate, Highland Lake, and Swiftwater Cliffs, each of which enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either a blue or red mana. And then there's Vivid Creek and Vivid Crag, which each enter the battlefield tapped with 2 charge counters on them. They can tap for one of our colors, or they can tap for any color if we remove a charge counter from them. And finally, we're running 26 basic lands, including 17 islands and 9 mountains. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGplayer optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Jori En EDH rec deck will set you back $148.25. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at just $19.85. Again, the price of this deck is the price that I got for it on the day that I'm recording. If you want to see a breakdown of this deck's cost, check out the link in the description. Keep in mind that prices can and will fluctuate and change over time. But with these deck costs, I want to be as transparent as I possibly can. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades now to see what some of those ways just might be. First, let's upgrade this deck by adding in Helm of Awakening and taking out Gearport Orrery. Cost reduction is huge for this deck, and Helm of Awakening is a fantastic way to do it. So we're also going to be adding in Foundry Inspector and taking out Read the Runes. Again, the more cost reduction we have, the better. And the best cost reducer might be Semblance Anvil, which we're going to add in by taking out Dramatic Reversal. By reducing the cost of our artifacts by 2, it makes pretty much all of them free. Next up, let's add in Jori, Weatherlight Captain, and take out Thoughtcast. Jori is a fantastic value engine in any kind of an artifact storm deck. And then we're going to add in Retract and take out the Antiquities War. When it comes to bouncing our artifacts, Retract is the most efficient way to do it. And finally, let's add in Aetherflux Reservoir and take out Gearport Aether Grid. Aetherflux Reservoir is an incredible win condition, especially in an artifact storm deck. But now it's time for me to hear from you. So why don't you let me know what your thoughts on this deck tech are in the comments below. And make sure that you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future Commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget Commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.